I'm Kate Solbaugh. I'm on the faculty here, and I've had the great pleasure of working with Linda McLean, Chris Collins, and Kiara Bridges in organizing and arranging this conference. And I just want to, you can always make mistakes thanking people, but I really want to extend special thanks to Linda, who has done tremendous work on, details, both very substantive and much less substantive, putting together this conference. So. And I also want to say that it is a really tremendous pleasure and honor for me to be able to introduce Joan Williams. And I wanted to talk about the conference organization as I did so because I think Joan's most recent book was influential for us in deciding to pursue this course. We knew we wanted to do a conference somewhere in the gender studies area, but a number of different forces came together. And I think Joan's book was one of the important things that happened. So Joan Williams, I think, her bio, someone quotes her from the New York Times as saying she's a rock star, which I think is kind of not something you want to say right before you go up on stage, right? So, but she really is a model, I think, for law professors to aspire to and how you think about a career unfolding. She has been writing about the role of care and family responsibilities in women's work life and their family life for several decades. She has written several books that have unfolded this idea and that have added nuance to the idea, that have taken in input from the outside. And I think you've really been successful when you articulate a new theory of law, which is this family responsibilities discrimination, how it might be based in other areas of law, and then the EEOC issues a guideline adopting your theory and bringing it into the law, which is what happened to Joan. And then, of course, if you're going to live that life, you're going to start a center. So, and she... Of course, she has a title, as do we all, so I should tell you what it is. Joan Williams is Distinguished Professor of Law, and she's also the UC Hastings Foundation Chair, and she's the founding director of the Center for Work-Life Law at the University of California. So among her 5 books, aside from the Unbending Gender book and the, the name? Reshaping the Work-Family Debate, Men and Class Matter, she also is the author of a book which is, I think it's, what is it called? Work-Life Laws Guide to Family Responsibilities Discrimination, which is like one of these loose leaf sort of practice guides. But again, it's a practice guide to an area of law that Joan Williams fundamentally authored. So, I feel tremendously, tremendously honored to be able to welcome her here to give our keynote address today. And I think without further ado, I would like to welcome Joan Williams.
Well, I'm really pleased to be here today, and and thank you, Kate, for that really kind introduction. I was telling Linda McLean, I actually just don't go to law professor conferences anymore. Since I founded the Center for Work-Life Law, I've sort of become a professional mendicant, and I only fly for money. So, but when I saw this conference, I thought, you know what, I really want to do this, so I'm just going to do it. And I'm really delighted to see so many old friends and to meet new people whose work I admire. I wanted to start out very briefly talking personally to Hannah about the hookup culture. I really admired her depiction of it because I have been watching as older feminists, such as myself, are extremely down on this, and I think it is very ambiguous. But I wanted to reassure you, because my kids are 10, 15 years older than yours, The upside of the hookup culture is that people don't have to lie to themselves and to each other, but mostly to themselves. Because when my generation was coming up, in order to hook up with somebody, you had to convince yourself you were in love with them. And you know what? I'll tell you a little secret. You weren't. And so there is an element of, there's all kinds of disturbing elements to the hookup culture. But I think there's also greater honesty among young people. And I think that's a very good thing. But what really jumped out at me in HannaRosin's The End of Men was the personal pain quotient that she captured. The unemployed husband whose wife derides him as a loser, the unemployed man whose wife makes fun of him for buying dress socks when he hasn't had a job interview in months, the blue-collar guys, just as to quote her, fucked and humiliated. The former miners, now on OxyContin. The unemployed sheetrock worker whose daughter's mother saw him waiting at the bus stop, just looked him in the eye and drove straight on. Rosin's reporting is stunningly good. But is this really a story about gender or a story about class? What Rosin documents is the end of a way of life. As she aptly noted, quote, "What dried up was a path to the middle class and all of the familiar landmarks that went with it." Sorry about that. Isn't the drying up of this path to the middle class, isn't that really the story? The top 1%, as we all know, alas, since I live near Berkeley, there are some people who actually thought the Occupy movement was going to change the politics of this country. It didn't, but at least it gave us a language for talking about what's happening to the top 1%. And what's happened to the top 1% is pretty sweet from the point of view of the top 1%. But it's come at the cost of eviscerating the path to a settled middle-class life. For 2 generations after World War II, men in the middle could deliver the house, the car, the washing machine with only intermittent part-time work from their wives. Since then, since 1969, men's median income has fallen nearly 30%. Today, 1 in 5 men aren't working, and even when the recession is over, and these are all statistics from Rosin's book, 1 in 6 won't be working. So to me, this is the story of the end of the middle class, not the end of men. Rosin struggles hard to account for the fact that the people who left the middle class so bereft are the men who are not ended in the least. Quote, "Yes, women still do most of the childcare," she says, and yes, the upper reaches of power are still dominated by men. But given the sheer velocity of the economic and other forces at work, these circumstances are much more likely to be the last vestiges of a vanishing age rather than a permanent configuration. Well, I actually looked this up. At the current rate of change, it will take 276 years for there to be an equal proportion of men and women as CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies. And it will take 97 years for there to be an equal proportion of men and women in Congress. Men run the economy, and they'll continue to do so for about 300 years at the current rate of change. It'll probably take longer than a century in Congress, since last year, for the first time, the percentage of women in Congress actually decreased. Sure, as Rosin points out, women are 45% of law firm associates. But in law, as elsewhere, women are allowed in on the ground floor, but they don't reach the top. Only 15% of law firm partners, equity partners, are women. And if you had told me when I graduated from Harvard Law School in 1980, that in 2012, only 15% of partners would be women, I would have told you you were out of your mind. And that percentage has actually fallen in recent years. The average female partner now earns $237,000 less than the average male partner. That's a number that's gone up from $162,000 less 2 years ago. The portrait I see is not the end of men. Actually, Rosin, with her astute reporter's eye, identifies some of the very specific reasons for this. Quote, women have to be more flexible, more intelligent, she notes. Being an average performer is just not an option for a woman. This is very true. 35 years of studies, of experimental social psychology studies, document in very grim and consistent detail that women need to give more evidence of competence than men in order to be judged equally competent. We heard one of those studies cited this morning. There are hundreds more. Due to descriptive gender bias, women have to prove themselves over and over again, a pattern I call prove it again. Rosin also quotes the psychologist Madeline Heilman, noting that women also have to walk a tightrope because high-status jobs, all of them, are seen as masculine. Then women need to behave in masculine ways in order to be seen as competent. But we all know what we call women who behave too masculinely, and it begins with a B. So you have to choose between being liked but not respected, and respected but not liked, in careers where getting ahead requires being both respected and liked. So due to prescriptive gender bias, women have to walk this tightrope between being too masculine and too feminine, which is a tightrope men don't have to walk. You know, walking this tightrope takes a lot of political skill, which is one reason why women need to be savvier than men in order to succeed in these careers. Rosin reports a, quote, fairly simple explanation for why women don't reach the top. They don't ask, they just negotiate less, and we've all heard this explanation. But Rosin's read the same study I've read. Both men and women are less willing to hire and show less willingness to work with women who negotiate, and also see women who do negotiate as less likable. Folks, women don't negotiate because they're not idiots. They know that they will encounter pushback if they do. And to say the reason women haven't reached the top is because they don't negotiate is part of a persistent pattern of using past discrimination to justify future discrimination. I've actually just completed 125 interviews of highly successful women, asking them about the 4 patterns of gender bias, of which prove it again and tightrope are only 2. We haven't even talked about by far the strongest, the gender bias triggered by motherhood, what we at the center called the maternal wall. Of those 125 women, only 5 reported never having seen these patterns, and 3 of those had founded their own businesses. I actually interviewed one woman who said she really wanted to talk to me. I met her in an event in Silicon Valley because she'd been out on her own for a while. She said she hadn't had to deal with this stuff, but now she was, her kids were a little older. She was going back into a corporation, so she knew she was going to have to deal with it. So she just figured this interview was sort of like a tune-up to deal with gender bias. So here's my plug. The center's most recent project is what's called the New Girls Network, And take your little machines out right now, and everybody go to newgirlsnet.com and click for me so I can get up on the Google search. Also, seriously, encourage your friends to do the same, and students to send questions, because what I've done is I've organized some of these highly successful women to give advice. There's a column called Ask the New Girls, and we already have a truly heartrending letter from actually a young African-American lawyer saying that she was so moved to see this site that she was very grateful. So please do send questions. Office politics is far trickier for women than for men, and we're here to help. So the picture I see is of elite men still on that invisible escalator. And they use that privilege to prove their manliness in very old-fashioned ways by engaging in minds bigger than yours risk games. You know those ones that almost bankrupted the country? This group of men is more than happy to hear pronouncements about the end of men. Quote, "Finally, someone's talking about our problems," a male partner at a big law firm commented to a woman partner, who of course then immediately emailed me. Now, it's definitely not the goal of the end of men to perpetuate the power of elite men. Unfortunately, that may be one of the results. You know, it's a long-standing American tradition to turn a story about class into a story about gender. It's one consequence of the American erasure of class. But the real story for me is about three different classes of men. I've talked about the elite. The second is the disenfranchised poor. And as William Julius Wilson told us long ago, when work disappears, so does marriage. And Rick Banks told us why again today. Men and women both see men who are unable to provide for their families as pathetic and useless. Underclass men ultimately turned in large numbers to the only pathway realistically open to them to work hard and provide, the drug trade. I now think of this as the wire effect. Something similar is now happening to white men. And of course, when it happens to white men, it's big news. Quote, "The way I was brought up, it was a man's responsibility to take care of his family," Rosin quotes one man. Why don't these guys go to college? It's actually not a mystery. Men don't like the idea of incurring large debts because they feel they should be able to support a family. Ironically, it may be precisely the pressure of the breadwinner ideal that makes these working class guys make choices that make them unable to be breadwinners. Now, as we all know, this happened to black men several generations ago. As I tell my students every year, when I was in college in 1972, I opened the New York Times and saw that 40% of young black men were unemployed in the inner city. And I thought, whoa, are we up a creek? And that's never changed. That's never changed. But what's happening now is that it's happening to white working class men. They too are seen as unsuitable marriage prospects, and so marriage dries up and single motherhood booms. Perhaps the solution is for these guys to take pink-collar jobs. But why can't I get over the sense that this is the professional elite whose men retain their access to good, traditionally male jobs, exhorting working class men to embrace dead-end, pink-collar jobs? Working class women traditionally have had very low expectations. That's true. So are we saying that the solution to spiraling income inequality in the United States is for non-elite men to lower their expectations too? I notice that we're not asking the men who shipped the blue-collar jobs abroad to take dead-end, feminized jobs. Is feminist solution to have access to normative masculinity as well as marriage become a class-linked privilege? Rosin's embrace of the term matriarchy is equally troubling. She acknowledges, quote, the contradictions of the new matriarchy with her and this just shows what an amazing reporter she is. How does she find these people? How does she get them to talk to her? This amazing story of this woman in the elevator who fell asleep between the first and the fourth floor because she was so exhausted working, going to school, and taking care of her kids. To call these women matriarchs really deserves them. These are vulnerable women left holding the bag, not castrating matriarchs. As we saw in the welfare debate, calling them matriarchs has really concrete consequences in terms of public policy, and none of those consequences are good. Rosin's most profound insight is that, quote, the real issue is not the end of men, but the disappearance of manhood. This is just so unbelievably astute, and I would really love to hear more about it. The challenge, as Rosin recognizes, is to encourage gender flux, to rip open the straitjacket of conventional masculinity. Denying non-privileged men access to normative masculinity, though, is not the answer. Encouraging new visions of masculinity for rich, poor, and the middle alike, that's what it'll take. One clue about how to proceed comes from Scho's and Gerstel's study that compares physicians and EMTs, and Rosin also cites this study. It's pretty fabulous. The study showed that male physicians just work extraordinarily long hours, and that their wives are really, really ticked about this. The men are very uninvolved with family life, and it also shows why the physicians resist their wives' fury. And it's because that's the way they show their manliness at work. The best quote, actually, is from Silicon Valley engineers. Quote, guys try to out-macho each other, but in engineering, it's really perverted, because that just means being more of a nerd than the next guy. It's not like being a brave firefighter and going up one more flight than your friend. It's a lot of, see how many hours I can work. He's a real man. He works a 90-hour a week. He's a slacker. He just works 50. Hours became the measure of professional commitment just when women started to enter these careers. And now I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it's a really interesting correlation that suddenly the one metric upon which women could never compete became the gold standard. Note, too, how the engineers assert their dominance over firefighters, who quite literally risk life and limb, thereby turning their pencil-pushing jobs into the true measure of heroism, just by staying awake. These are the elite men, like the doctors, who rarely see their children. The EMTs are far more involved in their kids' daily lives. They swap shifts quite regularly in order to pick up their kids from daycare, to feed them dinner, to take them to the doctor. But that does not mean that the EMTs have embraced feminized roles, not a bit. The EMTs felt free to use this strategy because their masculinity was already proven. Being an EMT is a highly masculinized career, and these guys worked more hours than their wives. So in other words, these working class guys use the same strategy that we women have used in fueling gender flux. We've entered into traditionally masculine roles at the same time as we continue to fulfill traditionally feminine ones, like the well-dressed woman and the good mother. So that's what the EMTs did. They felt free to share the care because they worked in a context where they felt their masculinity was secure. And you know what? That's how gender flux works. Gender roles are so profoundly intertwined with identity that people don't just jettison the traditional role. We make new friends and keep the old. Simply ripping away access to gender ideals is not a good recipe for flux. In fact, as The Wire illustrates so unbelievably poignantly, if men's access to the provider role is blocked, they will just find access to a different hypermasculinity. That process is already underway. We see that's why guns are such a volatile political issue in the United States among NASCAR men. Listen to how we literally name these men over a dangerous sport that involves speed and risk. Masculinity is precarious, as Joe Vandello, the social psychologist, has documented. This comes out strongly in Rosin's quote from the new TV show, Work It. Quote, "Women are taking over the workforce. Soon they'll have all the money and the power, and they'll start getting rid of the men. They'll just keep a few of us around for sex slaves." Dream on, guys. The end of men has actually spurred considerable number of these anxious sort of essays in print. I don't know if people have seen them. And you know what? Fueling masculine anxiety is just not a fruitful path to reconstructing gender. To achieve the goal that both Rosin and I share, we need to start deconstructing masculinity at the top. In a blog I co-authored with Sharon Mears, we quoted an executive looking ruefully at a rival's plane. And he looked at it and he said, and excuse the language, he said, someone's dick is always bigger. Here's the message we need to send. The economy is not about BSDs. Rosin points out that the Stephen Carell character in The Office, and she asserts that, quote, "the paternal white boss has become a punchline." Well, maybe a man in a routine white-collar job selling paper has become a punchline. Maybe a blue-collar guy out of work has become a punchline. But the men who hold economic and social power, they're not a punchline. I share with Rosin the goal of challenging masculinity as we know it. But you know what? That's the place to start. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions. If people have any questions for Joan? Or comments or discussion? Yes, June.
Joan, would you like to connect a few of the dots on the relationship between power of elite men and the increase in inequality? What that does?
I'm sorry, June, what did you say? Power of?
Elite men, 1% the financial system, the increasing competition. I assume you've heard winner take all politics, and the idea that what we're seeing at the bottom is a function of what's occurring at the top.
I mean, it's really clear in many ways. Both law firm partners and Mitt Romney personify this. The profits per partner and big law are actually now greater than they were before 2008. They're higher. And the way they've accomplished this is by hiring large numbers of lawyers who are officially off the partnership track. A number of firms have opened up big, basically lawyer factories, like in Pittsburgh and Cleveland, and pay people very low wages. And so you basically have, that is the way that they've kept up the profits per partner. Romney's dazzling success at Bain Capital really, again, epitomizes the strategy of increasing profits per partner to show whose is biggest at the top by cutting the wages of blue-collar men and women as well. And so there is a very, very direct relationship between masculine signaling at the top and the destruction of middle-class life. Now, I don't want to romanticize this too much. What it really was, there is it was a destruction of white middle-class life, but it's also been the destruction of black middle-class life, because for those 2 short generations after World War II, a lot of black families also gained access to the middle class through these blue-collar jobs, and that's gone.
HannaRosin mentioned wishing we had policies like the Nordic countries to help sort of create a different base to enforce some change at the top. I'm wondering, what if we were to all pledge to work on one policy or 2, what would you want us to do?
Well, the United States has by far the most family-hostile public policy in the developed world. There are only 4 countries in the world without paid maternity leave. Papua New Guinea, Swaziland, I've forgotten the third, and United States of America. I don't think anything's going to change there. I actually made a calculated decision 10 years ago not to spend 1 minute working on public policy because I thought it was just a waste of time. And that's why I turned to developing a litigation theory that's actually been very successful and has, in my opinion, really helped mothers from systematic marginalization. What we need in terms of social policy are new social programs. Raise your hand if you think we're going to have those, folks. And new workers' rights. Kathy, hats off to you. You couldn't write the books you do if you weren't the eternal optimist. So that's the bad news. I think the good news is that Sweden actually has a more sex-segregated economy than the U.S. does. These redistributive measures are phenomenally important because what they do is they sharply decrease maternal and child poverty. They do not deliver gender equality. They do not. The only way to deliver gender equality is to redefine workplace ideals. And so long as we define the ideal worker as someone who starts to work in early adulthood and works full-time, full force for 40 years straight, the opportunity for gender equality is non-existent. It will not happen.
Thank you. I really appreciate your comments. One thing I want to just mention, and I don't imagine you disagree, but I just want to point this out, and it makes me uncomfortable in the book. Also, is the parallel between what happened with black inner city. Deindustrialized family collapse and all that, and white working class men now. There's the commonality is the loss of jobs. Everything else is different. The scale is dramatically different in terms of the amount of jobs lost. White working class men are not unemployed at anything like the rates that black men were, and also ghettoized, policed, incarcerated. The numbers are just it's not we shouldn't make that comparison, except in a very unless we're being very specific about the aspect of it that we're talking about. And I don't think that's happening. I mean, in the same way, in some ways on the demographic numbers we've seen, black trends precede national trends, like on the rise of single motherhood and the decline in marriage and the increase in divorce. But that's superficial.
I actually disagree. I think that the proportions are very different. I mean, you have a racial hierarchy in the United States, and you're not going to have 40% unemployment of white men. I guarantee you. So there's a racial hierarchy in the United States. Absolutely, I agree. On the other hand, one of the things that Rosin's book does absolutely brilliantly is documents the absolute humiliation of these guys and the absolute sense that they are no longer men. And I think that's very similar, and I think it goes back to Rick Banks's comment. I mean, the last time I looked, and this is now an old study, I'm looking for I'd love a more recent one. The last time it looked, 82% of men and women thought it was a man's responsibility to support the family. That was, when was that, Naomi? That book was maybe 2000? Okay, so great progress, folks. Now it's 2/3. 2/3 of Americans, men and women, think it's men's responsibility to support the family. And so if you can't, you have this unbelievably high level of disrespect expressed towards men who can't. And that's the similarity. It's a different order of magnitude. I completely agree with you there.
Hi, Joan. I was just thinking that I can understand why you don't want to get involved in policy debates because it seems so hopeless, but it does seem to me we've made perhaps disconnected policy choices that have effects that boomerang in the areas that you're interested in. So, for example, the USTR practically gave away the textile industry as part of a strategy to enhance intellectual property rights in the Uruguay round. As a result of that, you see it play out in education. So you've lost the blue-collar jobs because so many of them shipped overseas. So it seems to me, the only way really to attack this problem is through education, because there really is no place for blue-collar workers to go now. And I wonder on education reform, what would be your thoughts there? Because you alluded to earlier the problem of debt, and men not going to college in part because they don't want to incur the debt. What I was thinking was perhaps education reform is a place where all sides could come together to a certain extent, because nobody, I think, is happy with the debt on both sides of the aisle. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on education reform.
I'm not an expert on education reform, and I think it would be a good thing. I did start out was teaching local government law and as a city planner, and in terms of we have such a screwed up system for financing education, I tell you, very hopeful. I also think there is, remember, I've forgotten which presidential, was it Rick Santorum that said, Barack Obama said everybody should go to college, what a snob? Who was that? And everybody made fun of him. I think what we need, if I were queen of the universe, where I look to is Germany. What we need is industrial policy. What we need is a policy that doesn't assume that every single person is a wordsmith who needs to go to college. I think what we need is greater dignity for the people who fix our cars and do a lot of these highly skilled jobs. I mean, I'm a big believer in the idea that there is no such thing as an unskilled job. A hotel housekeeper who is trained can make up 8 rooms a day instead of 6 rooms a day. And you know what? That's hard work, it's skilled work, and I'm glad I don't have to do it. But the person who does it should be treated with dignity and should have a living wage. We should have a respect for a far broader range of jobs. And I think we, in the intellectual elites, simply forget that what we do is really, really specialized, and it ain't for everybody, and we're really overcompensated. So yay for that. Thank you.
Thank you.